You know what? Fine. Let's just talk about the notch in the iPhone 10. See, I thought one of the most disturbing things for most people when moving to the iPhone 10, before it was announced and everything, I thought the big complaint was going to be no Touch ID. They were going to be skeptical about switching to Face ID. They would be too dependent on Touch ID. And constantly, I always tried to say, hey, they're still making 2 phones this year with Touch ID on them, and they're probably the fastest they've ever been, powered by the A11 chip, and they're still encrypted. You still have that option on most Apple products. But no, as the release has happened, I've seen a lot less complaints about the lack of Touch ID. I'm sure they're there. People will find every single reason to complain. But by far the thing most people are complaining about is, for one, the price. Oh my god, an Apple product is expensive? Never seen that one coming before. But secondly, I think the most popular complaint is about that notch. And what's interesting is I've seen kind of a very even split in both halves. By both halves, I mean Apple fans and Apple haters, or you could even say people in the middle, people who don't hate Apple but don't love Apple. They use Apple products but don't necessarily have a sheepish attitude towards them. Basically everyone. There are some Apple fans who like the notch and some Apple fans who do not like the notch. There's also some Apple haters who of course hate the notch, and also some haters who even are fine with the notch. That doesn't bother them about the iPhone. And like I said, people in the middle, people who don't necessarily love Apple but don't necessarily hate them. Some of them like the notch, some of them don't. It's just a very mixed bag. And I've noticed that there's kind of a half full, half empty look at the notch. Some people look at the notch and see it as a way of intruding on your content. When you're watching a video or when you're scrolling through Twitter, that giant notch is cutting into your display. That's preventing you from experiencing a full normal display, like something you'd get on a Galaxy S8 or V30. Darn that notch, right? How could Apple do this? It's intruding on everything. While other people are looking at those ears and looking at them as an extension. They're saying we have the Wi-Fi icon, we have the cellular bars, we have the battery icon. All of that needs to be stored on our display anyway. Why not push it out of the way of our content and push it up into those little ears? That way it's not intruding on our regular apps or our regular videos, which I find interesting. You know, some people can look at that as an extension and some people can look at it as an intrusion. And many times I've seen people talk about the fact that they wish there was an option in the settings that would allow them to deactivate the ears or whatever and just make that part of the phone black. Since this is an OLED display, hopefully that means those pixels would just flat turn off, and perhaps maybe the only thing up there would be those icons, you know, the time, the Wi-Fi, the battery. Those would be in white on a black background and they would never highlight depending on what app you're using. For the people who find the notch as more of an intrusion, I have a couple solutions for you to keep in mind. That the iPhone 10, while it does not have stock options built in, there's a couple things you can do to erase the notch. And one thing I've thought of is that it probably isn't very difficult to make a wallpaper that simply has a black top, which means that if you set a certain image that is edited just a little bit as your wallpaper, your home screen could effectively erase the display from being highlighted up there, while of course still keeping your time, Wi-Fi, battery, and so forth. So that is an extra step. It is a little bit annoying, yes, but I'm saying it is possible to get that look at least on your home screen. And the other thing I want people to keep in mind is that a lot of third-party apps are probably not going to be supported right away when you get your iPhone 10. A lot of third-party apps definitely take their time to optimize themselves for new tech that changes resolution and it changes aspect ratio, and we've seen from a couple leaked images, like this one with a user supposedly using Spotify, I think, that when an app is not updated, the notch is not going to be highlighted, except those special icons, the Wi-Fi, the time, are still going to be up there, making sure that the app itself doesn't look as messy, meaning those little widget icons are not going to be a part of the app themselves. They will be lifted off, providing a more clean look in the app itself. And looking at it from a wider standpoint, third-party apps actually could decide to black out that part of the phone. So maybe even if the YouTube app or the Spotify app decides to update their app to support the iPhone 10, they could decide for it to be an option for its users to not highlight the notch or to highlight the notch. It's not something that Apple is requiring. If you update your app for the iPhone 10, you are not required to have your display and content highlight that notch. You could make it an option, or perhaps even not an option, to cover up that notch and just leave those little ears on your side for your tiny icon widgets. Based on a lot of leaks we've seen, it seems like they're not doing that. Like the Instagram app, as we've seen, is already updated for the 10. They highlight the notch, and from what I've seen, there's no option for you to turn that off. But I'm just saying, down the road, this could be possible. It's very, very unlikely, but Apple does have the capabilities to perhaps one day do a software update for the iPhone 10 that would allow you to deactivate the display going up into those ears and just leave it as the icon widgets. But Apple's typically not one about having options. It's still not to say it's completely impossible that they may do that at some point while you're owning your iPhone 10. And in terms of all these different perspectives on the notch, a lot of people are wondering what I think. Do I think it's a good thing? A lot of people actually like it. A lot of people prefer it and think that if the iPhone 10 did not have a notch, it would actually look kind of weird. Personally, I see it this way. The top of our phones are going to have those little icon widgets whether we have a notch or not. And by far one of my biggest complaints with Android is the fact that the top of the phone fills up with so many different things. It looks so complicated every time you get a notification. And I think Android's pretty bad at notification management. They give you notifications for every tiny thing. That fills up really quick. It looks busy and I don't like how cluttered it is. And already on my pre-existing iPhone 8, don't really enjoy the fact that no matter what app I'm in, I always have to have the time at the top. I always have to have the name Verizon in the corner with the cell bars and the battery. I think that looks kind of busy. And to imagine an app where we finally make use of that space above our phone and push all of that information to the top, I think it actually makes our display area a lot cleaner. I don't consider these little ears part of the display area. You're not really meant to interact with that. You're not really meant to look at that and enjoy content. The only reason you look at the very top of your display is to read quick information like the Wi-Fi, battery, cellular, and so forth. I'm not really sure how Apple's getting away with it, but I really enjoy the fact that we no longer have to have our carrier name in the top of our phone. The fact that it always has to be there is kind of annoying to me, and I think what the iPhone 10 does is make good use of every bit of space there is on the front of the phone. As we've seen in leaks, there's not much landscape options in the iPhone 10, and I think that's fine. With this new aspect ratio, you probably wouldn't want to use the iPhone 10 in landscape mode for too many things. Games maybe, in movies sure, but keep in mind movies you can double tap and shrink in the video so that the notch is not intruding if that bothers you. I'm anticipating that whenever the YouTube app is updated, it will probably work in a similar way. When you use YouTube on the Galaxy S8, for example, that display is not 16:9, so you have the option of blowing it up and cropping in on the video a little bit to experience that full infinity display, but you also have the option of cutting it down to retain its 16:9 and make sure you're not missing any of the video, but the sides of your Galaxy S8 will look like they have a bit wider bezels just to fit that 16:9 display. So I'm anticipating YouTube is probably going to do a similar thing with the 10. I'm assuming that's what most people are watching videos on. We already know that the Videos app that Apple has on there, you can double tap and it will zoom in and embrace the notch, or you can double tap again and erase the notch. You have that option, and I think that the iPhone 10 took an original approach. Instead of having a fairly large chin and forehead, it has the same size bezel all the way around and that notch cut out at the top because it absolutely needs to be there. There is not yet a way to embed Face ID or the front-facing speaker underneath the screen, and I'm sure that Apple's working on that because I feel like if Apple had the option to remove the notch, they probably would. So my take on it is I don't necessarily like the notch, but I don't really like anyone else's approach of making a smartphone. To not have the notch and to just have a slightly larger forehead would have kind of bothered me because I would have looked at the phone and said that there's empty space in these parts that are not being taken advantage of. And if they made the chin and forehead the same size, I would have said Apple is just duplicating what every other Android developer has done this year. It's not that exciting. I appreciate that Apple took an original approach, and I think it is the best approach because it makes best use of every part of the display. It's all about efficiency. You gotta have those icons regardless, so you might as well push them to the very, very tip of the phone, which is something that the Galaxy S8 or V30 can't do because they have that big forehead. But of course, I can totally understand people who don't like the notch. Keep in mind that Apple still made 2 other iPhones this year that don't have the notch. The iPhone 10 is not necessarily for everyone. I think it's more for people who wanted a drastic change for the iPhone lineup and are willing to start learning things differently in favor of a more original design approach. Because some people were tired of the iPhone 8's classic design we've had since the iPhone 6, but some people were ready for a change, and I think Apple did the wise thing of making something that hopefully appeals to as many people as possible. Of course, let me know all your thoughts on the iPhone 10's notch. Do you think it's gonna feel weird one day when it's not there and Apple truly does have the same size bezel all the way around? Do we want that? Do we not want that? I'm curious on your thoughts, so let me know. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I will see you in the next one.